All right, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. Let's jump right in. Today we're going to be discussing those digital dividends that we thought the internet would deliver, and despite the title, this is not going to be a pessimist fiesta. We will evaluate each of those dividends, whether it's exceeded expectations or fallen short, and why or why not that may have happened. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel. I'm Evan Swartztrauber. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at Tech Freedom. We're a tech policy think tank based here in DC. On my left is Steve Del Bianco, Executive Director of NetChoice, an association representing e-commerce companies. He helps his members define and execute the tech agenda. On his left is Nomini Rubin, Vice President at Tetra Tech. She leads engineering and consulting projects to increase energy and internet access in developing countries. On her left, Christina Sandifer, Executive Vice President at the Goldwater Institute, which engages in public interest litigation on behalf of consumers and entrepreneurs, some of those barriers that the chairman was talking about. And on her left is Daniel Castro, Vice President at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, better known as ITIF, and he directs ITIF's Center for Data Innovation. And last but not least, Robert Pepper, Head of Global Connectivity Policy and Planning at Facebook, where he focuses on new technology development, deployment, and adoption. So as you can see, we've got an expert panel here, and this should be fun. So what do we mean by the digital dividends we thought the internet would deliver? Well, Bill Gates back in 2000 gave a speech at the Creating Digital Dividends conference where he was trying to imagine what we would see. You know, this was very early on. People had just started to really regularly use the internet, and he was trying to project out to basically where we are now. What sorts of dividends would people enjoy from the internet? And there's this quote that kind of captures this idea nicely. The idea of a tool for an individual that lets you really find information and create things on your own, where you would have the tools to share with other people, to track data, to learn things in new ways. That was really only a glimmer in a few people's eye. Clearly today, that is not just a glimmer, that's our experience. And then he went on to say, a very optimistic premise that I have, which is that if you give people tools, their natural ability, their curiosity, they will develop it in ways that will surprise you very much beyond what you might have expected. So let's jump right into our first topic, the economy. One of the narratives out of this election and Brexit and many of the other populist movements that we heard about earlier today is that despite technological growth and innovation and how it's helped the economy and increased productivity, it hasn't spread everywhere. There are definitely people who are not feeling those dividends, and maybe they have voiced those concerns in the form of elections. So Steve, you represent e-commerce companies. Many of these companies say that they are offering people an opportunity to make money just from having an internet connection, just from their creativity. To what extent has the internet delivered an economic dividend for the average person?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. The secret sauce of the American economy is the fact that we seem to be able to seize upon the next big thing. Just think about mass production, automated manufacturing, telecommunications, computing, and now the services that are enabled by the internet, which you described. But a century ago, most Americans were concentrated in small towns running small businesses. In fact, 1/3 of us a century ago would have been working on or connected to a farm. And then we all migrated to the big cities for manufacturing jobs because that was the next big thing 100 years ago. And those jobs were 40 hours a week with lifetime benefits. But today those jobs are waning due to automation and to a lesser extent global competition. And that's where digital dividends could help individuals, as Vint Cerf asked us to do. So for the geeks and the wonks, here's a simple formula for this. You start with economic liberty, as Maureen Olhausen described it, and you multiply it by internet technology and connectivity, which has 3 sub-factors. Number 1, it has two-sided market platforms, which match producers with consumers. Think eBay buyers with eBay sellers, or Uber drivers and Uber riders, Airbnb owners and renters. And when you put those together on a two-sided market, there's a network effect in the sense that as every new person joins either side of the network, the entire network is worth more to everyone who's already in it. Second factor, peer review, both review of consumers and consumers reviewing who producers are. Third is portability. Imagine if the only way you could use Lyft and Uber was to sit at your desktop computer and open it up in order to summon a car. So portability on mobile is a huge benefit. So those 3 aspects are what we have designed in our industry. And the payoff in digital dividends is supposed to be income opportunities for those who produce. These are the producers that Maureen talked about who need the ability to make a living producing. And then the consumer benefits, which are innovation, competition, better services, and lower prices. Now, the dividends, they're evident, but they're hard to measure because we don't have the right vocabulary. Too many times we'll all say it's the sharing economy, but there's nothing sharing about somebody driving for Lyft or Uber or sharing a home. You're renting, or in some cases, doing services. And the word gig economy only captures a little bit of the peer-to-peer economy because it captures the notion where I'm doing work or a gig. So I think a better term is the notion of peer-to-peer. And it has all three elements of it. It has the goods economy on eBay and Etsy. It has the asset economy of Airbnb, HomeAway, and Turo. But it also has the gig economy of Lyft, of Uber, of TaskRabbit and Thumbtack. So internet platforms should be enabling Americans to earn extra income by using their skills and their assets and selling goods that others can't find. But, there's some headwinds in the way, which I know we're going to talk about later.
So there are many reasons why simply having an internet connection and having access to these platforms might not yield a dividend, but sometimes there are real barriers in the way, whether that's from your local government or your state government, or whether it's a legacy industry that has captured those governments. So Christina, this is right at the heart of the work that the Goldwater Institute does on behalf of consumers. To what extent is licensing or legacy industries lobbying to try to shut down technology, to what extent is that the problem when people are trying to use the internet to earn income?
Yeah, it's a big problem. I am someone who sues the government for a living, and I work for a federalism organization, so oftentimes we're looking for state solutions to push back against federal overreach. So this is going to be one of the rare instances when you're going to hear me commend the federal government for its work here, because the FTC is really light years ahead of state and local governments here in the United States, and I'm excited to see with our new chair how far the FTC can go going forward. Local and state governments are particularly susceptible to regulatory capture in the United States, and we have seen this pay out in what I'm going to use the term sharing economy, even though I understand your objections to it, Steve. But we've seen that pay out, right? Anything from let's look at Uber and Lyft, right? Ride-sharing opportunities that have seen a lot of pushback from more established industries like the taxi industry, even though when you look at it at its essence, ride-sharing is nothing new, right? People have been giving friends or sometimes even strangers rides to the airport in exchange for maybe splitting gas money or other compensation for decades. The internet has just made that easier and more efficient and arguably safer. Same thing with home sharing, right? We look at Airbnb and HomeAway. Those services have just provided more information so that consumers have more choices and lower prices, and homeowners are able to pay off their mortgages and make extra money. The internet has really had unbelievable effects on the sharing, on our ability to share with each other. But interestingly enough, it's really not revolutionary in that it doesn't tend to bring new products or services to light. We're just talking about sharing more information about industries or activities that have existed for a very long time. But of course, there's no innovation that government doesn't want to regulate, and the sharing economy is no exception. And so we see established industries, let's take home sharing, for example. We see the hotel industry come out and go city by city and state by state to try to impose regulations on Airbnb, on HomeAway, and on individuals who want to share their homes on those online platforms and visitors who want to rent homes on those online platforms. Make no mistake, these regulations are all about anti-competition. They are not truly about consumer safety. And why do I say that? Well, if they were truly about consumer safety, cities would enforce the ordinances they already have on the books. How often do you hear regulators say, my gosh, if we allow people to open up their homes to overnight guests, we're going to have noise problems, we're going to have people parking in the wrong places, we're going to have trash problems. And of course, all of those things do happen occasionally. The data actually shows that they happen just as often with long-term renters or people who live in a home year-round. But nevertheless, if that is really the harm, if those were really the harms that cities and other regulators were looking to prohibit, then they would regulate, they would enforce their nuisance ordinances across the board for all residential uses. Instead, what we see or instances like New York, where they're outlawing advertising on Airbnb and HomeAway of homes for rent to the tune of fines of $7,500 for violating those advertising bans. San Francisco, which is requiring platforms like Airbnb and HomeAway to turn over their people who use their services to the authorities so that they can then regulate and fine them. Privacy concerns. In Hawaii, we've actually seen regulators going door to door, knocking on people's doors and asking them, are you a guest of the homeowner or are you renting from Airbnb? We see in Chicago, inspectors have come to people's homes unannounced. They've claimed that they can come into your home if you want to rent on Airbnb or HomeAway without a warrant, without a reason, at any time, and in any manner in order to inspect your home. These are privacy violations that we don't even see inflicted upon hotels. And a New York Times study has shown that the hotel industry has really engaged here. They've put a lot of money. In fact, they even put together a battle plan to try to combat Airbnb and HomeAway because they're worried that that's going to dig into their bottom line. Now, typically in a free market, the way that we compete, if we have innovators that come in and offer better goods or services to consumers, is we're supposed to convince those consumers that we also have good services, and we're supposed to innovate and create better problems for our products for our consumers. But instead, what we see is established, entrenched industries that are going to government, that are lobbying government to outlaw their competition in ways that are not helping consumers, but instead are protecting established industries. At the Goldwater Institute, we have taken to state courts primarily and state legislatures to try to push back against this regulatory overreach, because if you think about it, these regulations are violating people's constitutional rights, whether it be your right to privacy, as I mentioned, or your right to free speech. If you're putting regulations on internet and internet alone, you're really just regulating the free flow of information. And as long as that information isn't fraudulent in any way, it ought to be protected to the highest degree, and it is protected by the First Amendment.
So thank you, Christina. I just want to take this a little international, because those are some great examples of how in the United States we've seen maybe a backlash. And it might seem mundane when we look in a broader context internationally. So Robert, you focus on deployment of services in the developing world, where there are all sorts of challenges, maybe lack of infrastructure or an authoritarian regime, and things like WhatsApp are actually economic opportunities in countries where communication is a lot harder. So it's not just about Uber and Airbnb. We're talking about all sorts of over-the-top platforms. And what happens when a government tries to look at an over-the-top application and say, that is a telecommunications service, not a over-the-top information service, and how does that impact the people in those developing countries?
Great question. So you may know that recently there was a study done by the German consultancy called WIC. And what they did was they took a look at what they called, by the way, when you talk about over-the-top OTT, when I was at the FCC, we used to call that the internet. It's like, okay, it's over the top. I don't know quite what that means, other than the fact it's a set of applications that ride on networks. So the WIC, what they did was they took a look at what they ended up calling, it's kind of an awkward name, Rich Interaction Applications, RIAs. They looked at 164 countries. They identified 139 RIAs, Rich Interaction Applications. And what they found was that the average Rich Interaction Application the average one has 9 functions. Some have as many as 23 different functions. And they're adding new functions every other month. So when you look at these rich interaction applications, they are not the same thing as just a text or traditional voice, right? Chat may be embedded, or the ability to have a voice conversation like on WhatsApp or Messenger, or video with FaceTime or on Skype or WeChat in China. These are not the same things. But what they did was they took a look, and this goes to the dividend question. They took a look over the last 16 years And we all know that, the famous World Bank study that said for every 10% increase in adoption of the internet, you can have as much as a 1.5% GDP increases in developing countries. They quantified that, right? And if you take that and you look across the 164 countries they looked at, that actually translates to $4.8 trillion increase over that 16-year period in GDP. When you look at rich interaction applications, actually the contribution to GDP, global GDP increase was $5.6 trillion. This is a huge dividend from the internet, right? It's demonstrable. It's not a forecast going forward. It's actually looking at what happened between 2000 and 2015. What we're now seeing, however, and by the way, just in the U.S., there was almost a doubling between 2010 and 2015 in terms of consumer surplus, right? WIC estimated that in the U.S., the rich interaction applications had a consumer surplus doubling from 11 billion, almost doubling from 11 billion to about $21 billion just in the U.S. So, but what we're seeing is, not in the U.S., but internationally, many of the incumbent operators are going to their governments and saying, regulate these applications because we need a, quote, level playing field, right? That's a great phrase. I remember at the FCC, we had large incumbent operators. There were, at that time, 7, and then they kept shrinking down the number, called Baby Bells, coming to us saying, it's not fair. We have all of these little entrants, CLECs, or non-dominant operators, and trying to enter like MCI. We had to dial 16 different numbers to make a long-distance call. It's not fair that you don't regulate the same as us, right? That's not a level playing field. And we actually said, well, no, actually, they're not the same as you. You're dominant. They're not. So we're not going to impose all the same levels of regulation. But what we're seeing globally is that operators are going to their governments and saying, regulate these applications up the stack as though they are traditional telephone services. And this is having a significant impact in those countries, harming innovation, right? And the threat is harming these economic benefits that WIC identifies from these rich interaction applications. This would be harmful, especially harmful in the developing countries where it's the consumer surplus and the benefits to consumers from the applications up the stack that really are driving this dividend from having the internet.
So we've identified how government could potentially be in the way of realizing a dividend, but let's not just spend the entire time beating up on government, because there are potential other actors at play who might be preventing the dividend from being realized. So Daniel, what role do data intermediaries play in this equation? You've got a lot of companies, some have a lot more data than others, and maybe for someone trying to get off the ground and make money off of data or to do something creative with data, there are gatekeeper problems. They might not have access to it because there's not enough open source data out there. So how do you see the role of data intermediaries in whether or not an individual can realize an economic dividend from the internet?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, starting off with that Bill Gates quote, we do see this kind of, there's the vision of where technology could take us, and then there's the reality, and we see these gaps, and we have to keep asking, why are there these gaps? Because it's really not the technology that's been underperforming. So I think it makes sense that we beat up on government in many of these cases, but you have to look at why government's doing it. Government's not doing these things purely because they want to, have consumers not have great access to certain technology. They're doing it because there's another business interest that's pushing them to do this. And so, sometimes we see anti-competitive laws being put out there. And sometimes we see just anti-competitive actions that are happening. And I think we're seeing this anti-competitive action kind of move up the stack right now. And in particular, there's an area around data that I think is very important right now, where the issue here isn't that companies can have a lot of data, and by having a lot of data, they're somehow anti-competitive or bad. Facebook is an open platform. So I can go and advertise on Facebook. Anyone can go online and advertise on Facebook. Google's an open platform. They have a lot of data, but anyone can connect to them. Anyone can build apps that work with them. That's not the problem. The problem isn't a lot of data. The problem is that you have some companies that have specialized data, and they're using their specialized access in ways that are anti-competitive. So, for example, some banks will restrict companies like Mint and these other kind of third parties from accessing consumers' data with the consumer's permission. So it's not a privacy issue. It's not a security issue because it's the consumer giving up their own information. They're just saying we don't want this third party to get access to it. Now, of course, they're doing it generally because there's something, not to their advantage. So maybe the consumer learns that they're paying too high of rates, that they're paying higher fees, that maybe there's a better option somewhere else. Maybe the company is providing an add-on service. We're seeing this with airlines and online travel agencies, where airlines are restricting the information that these third-party sites can use. So when you're going online, you want to compare tickets, or you want to make a booking, you can't necessarily do it through a third party or check some of the information because that data is not flowing out there. We're also seeing this in real estate. So realtors are cracking down on the data that can go out to third parties like a Redfin or a Zillow. And all of these restrictions really interfere with that vision of kind of where we're coming from, which is that you can have all these different parties, stakeholders, make use of the internet to create new types of services to empower consumers. So the technology is there, the data is there, but sometimes there's a barrier. And so, one of the things we should also be talking about is not only what kind of government's doing wrong, but where it can also, start using its authority to crack down on some of these anti-competitive behaviors that are really disadvantaging, entrepreneurial companies and consumers.
So one other barrier, aside from all of those very complex ones which we just discussed, is education. If you are not trained the right way, or if you don't have the right skills to use these platforms, it doesn't matter if you have 4 options for high-speed broadband in your neighborhood, that doesn't fix the education problem. So Nomini, when you were in government, you were instrumental in spearheading the Digital Gap Act, which that's exactly what it sounds like, trying to bridge the digital divide in education. And what can government do to help prepare people for the rapid changes in technology that might see them not having a 25-year job, but instead a 2-year job, and they're moving around a lot and they have to move their location a lot? And to what extent has the internet delivered an educational dividend? Because there's been so much promise about that. Bill Gates talked about it, and we hear things like the Khan Academy and Coursera and universities like MIT putting their courses online, but have we really figured out a way to deliver that educational dividend through the internet?
Thank you very much. So I used to work for the House Foreign Affairs Committee for Chairman Rice, and the Digital Gap Act promotes internet access in developing countries, and in a kind of a thoughtful approach where it works with the private sector rather than having governments do it. So we worked on that bill because we recognized that the gap in education and also in gender, the digital gap is increasing for women, and women, even if you look at offline education, suffer from less education than men worldwide. So it was kind of a twofer of a bill. Before you mentioned the Bill Gates quote, so I wanted to kind of come back with a Mary Meeker quote from 1996, where she said, "It's likely that development of the internet won't be as easy as it sometimes appears. There will be bumps along the way. There always have been, always will be. Been there, done that." So I know that the education hasn't been transformed immediately with the internet, but we're still in the early stages, so we still have a ways to go. With education, especially technology, isn't going to be the answer because there's more than one question. And so how many people are here today in the room? Raise your hand. Yeah, right? Like, that was a kind of a trick, like you all should be raising your hand. Because we have a lot of people viewing online, and you all chose to be here in person for a reason. And the same way with internet education, there's going to be reasons where you're going to want to do it offline and in person, and the delivery of education online is not going to be the perfect fit for everybody at every age. So we're seeing really great developments with entities like
indicators for each country. By the way, the data is all available publicly down to the Excel spreadsheets. So among the things that we found, right, picking up on the education question, on the supply side, that's pretty typical. It's availability. Are the networks there? Can you connect? What's the network performance? And affordability was a second category. But then we were looking at on the demand side at both relevance and readiness. And what we found on the readiness side was that there's a large portion of again, globally, of the people, a lot of people have the internet available to them, but they are not online, right? And even when they are, they're underconnected. And one of the questions is, why are people not online when they could be, right? In part, it's because they do not see why it's relevant to them. This is the relevance question. Why should I? What difference does it make to me? I don't think it's important. We can talk about that. But there was another component, which was readiness. And readiness is education. It's about digital literacy. It's understanding how to get online and then how to benefit from it. So it's not just being connected. So the study's called the Internet Inclusion Index, and internet inclusion is not the same as just being connected. You need to have more than that. One of the surprise findings that was frankly really disappointing is we found that the gender gap in using and benefiting from the internet was growing, not shrinking, right? And this is just not acceptable. You cannot have an inclusive internet if half the people on the planet are not as connected as the other half.
That was a good line. So I'm getting a generally optimistic vibe from Nilmini. I think she's saying that, maybe we're 20 years into the commercial internet as we know it, and it's a bit premature to say that it's either a failure for education or a huge success. Daniel, do you kind of see it going that way? Is it a general trickle up, and are we going to just see education more and more digitized in a good way, or are you a little bit skeptical about that?
I think some of the critiques have been unfair, especially about MOOCs. There've been a lot of studies that talk about like the attrition rates on MOOCs. If you look at the attrition rate of a conference like this, there's less people at the end of the day than at the beginning. That just is kind of a natural thing that happens. But I think, more broadly, one of the biggest problems we have with education in the U.S. is that, the credentialing program that we have set up and basically how we do higher ed. So. The problem that you have is you have students going through and they want to get a diploma. They'll pay a lot for this diploma, and they'll pay a lot, so people will give them one if they give them enough money. But that diploma doesn't really mean anything. If you're an employer, right now a college student coming out of different universities, even the best universities, you can't really tell how good they are based on this diploma. It doesn't really give you much information. It's very different than some of the alternatives that we're seeing out there, where people are getting micro-credentials, they're getting more targeted information, more detailed information about people. So there's this real kind of broken system in the sense. The students are paying for a credential that isn't very valuable to employers. This doesn't really make any sense. The question is, can we separate those two things out? So schools are actually responsible for teaching students, and that's what their incentive is to do, is to teach them the best they can. And there's some other entity that's out there that's responsible for credentialing students. We're basically giving people credentials that say, yes, you're very qualified at this type of thing, and that's very valuable to employers. So if you can separate those two things out, I think then you make space for innovation and competition in this area, which doesn't exist right now because we have a very faulty system. So I think until we get to some of those fundamental issues, it'll be really hard to see some of the online education benefits take off.
Steve, you want to jump in here to discuss the accreditation issue? And
it's partly that, but if you have availability of adequate speed internet and are you not using it, we have to start looking at whether the payoff is there, that the dividend, it pays off in the way that they think it is. For so many of the Americans who aren't even in our workforce, the notion of higher speed internet so they can look at more stuff they can't afford, they can read more news they don't care about, it's not the attraction. I do think the attraction will have to come if they view the internet as enabling them to be able to sell services or assets that they have. Some guy's awfully good at fixing cars, but he hasn't had a job in 12 years. If he finds that there's an ability to advertise his services locally, to be able to enter that marketplace, I believe they'll enter from the producer side, not just the consumer side. And sure enough, they'll need a higher speed connection to do that. But an incentive for inclusion is an essential element, not just the availability, but the incentive. And sure enough, if enough of that happens in certain communities, they'll run up against the barriers we're all worried about. But we're used to fighting barriers, and we'll work together on that. But to Robert's point, there are too many who don't yet see the incentives to be included in the internet, and I think it's going to come from the producer side and not the consumption side.
And one of the big problems with education, at least in the United States, I know there are people from other countries who might think this is ridiculous, but in the past 50 years, the cost of education has gone up tenfold. And this is getting to what Tyler Cowen calls cost disease. He identified the same problem in healthcare. Now, when we think about the internet, when we think about dividends, we like to think that it lowers costs. The cost of communication has gone down. While sending an SMS text message in Brazil is extremely expensive, using WhatsApp is free. And it's a lot cheaper to communicate. We have access to more information. So that's a clear dividend. And let's not get all pessimistic here. The internet's great, right? But it has not reduced the cost of education the way it has reduced the cost of storage and the way that processors have just plummeted in cost and the way that bandwidth has plummeted in cost. So this can go to any of my excellent panelists. Why hasn't the internet led to a decrease in the cost of education or a decrease in the cost of healthcare if communication is such a big part of healthcare and education, and that is so cheap? No, Manny?
Very quickly, it's because there's supply and demand. So it might have lowered the cost of the supply of education and healthcare, but there's still a massive demand for healthcare services and education. And so where they meet is the price, and it's just gone up. In countries where you have fixed prices on education or on healthcare, you see lower costs.
Steve?
And that higher cost service is typically where there's more and more value being added. We're all spending more money every year on our smartphones than we did 2 years before because they do more. But there have to be alternatives sometimes, a low-cost alternative. In the case of education, it could be the online courses that are the low-cost alternative. In the case of healthcare, it might well be the sort of distance healthcare where a doctor is able to do diagnosis and maybe some measurement and education of a particular patient. And that sort of distance or telemedicine is a digital dividend that has not been delivered in the United States. I don't know the state of play around the world, but in the U.S., one of the chief barriers to that digital dividend is reimbursement. It could be a lot less expensive to deliver telemedicine, but no doctor is going to do it if they can't get paid for it. If either the insurance companies or, worst case, Medicare, Medicaid, our government doesn't recognize it as a valid way of delivering service, albeit at a fraction of the cost, it isn't going to become available. So we do need to pressure our institutions, those that handle reimbursement, to be more tolerant and experimental of lower cost solutions. Let the really expensive care continue to go up to meet supply and demand, but there's an unmet need, an unmet demand for lower cost delivery of education and healthcare.
And certainly making money is an issue. Thankfully, there are some doctors that, despite not having the opportunity for reimbursement, have been providing these services, in particular to low-income countries around the world, where you might have a doctor in Kansas helping a patient in Africa. And that's pretty incredible, and they're definitely not getting paid for that. So thankfully, people are still altruistic, despite not being reimbursed. But Daniel, telehealth, e-health, that's in your portfolio at ITIF, along with many other issues. How do you see the state of telemedicine, and why are we not seeing that dividend? Or am I wrong, and we are seeing that dividend, it's just too soon to tell?
Well, I think the work that Commissioner Olhausen referenced is really one of the key issues that we're seeing. We did a report about 3 years ago where we dug into this. And I mean, certainly reimbursement's a huge issue, especially when you're talking about, government as the payer. But, if anyone, I don't know how many people in the room have used telehealth. I used it the first time a couple of years ago, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's the best experience ever. You're doing it, you're consulting with a doctor in the comfort of your own home. You're not going to a doctor's office where you feel like you might be getting sicker just from being there. You're not having to wait, however long. You don't have to schedule an appointment. You just click a button and you're talking to a doctor immediately. You can do it in the middle of the night when you're feeling bad. You don't have to wait till the day. So I loved it. The first time I saw a telehealth doctor, I had been to my regular doctor and they had misdiagnosed me. And I was, why am I not getting better? I talked to the telehealth doctor and, I point my webcam at a few things and we clear it all up. It's so much better, but I had to pay for that out of pocket, right? And I also could only see a doctor that was in my state, which didn't make any sense because there were plenty of doctors in another time zone that would have been happier to see me. And so, it's these cross-state licensing issues that really get in the way. It's the payer issues that get in the way. It's not the technology right now. And that's what's, I think, so amazing is that, we have these, fantastic kiosks especially. So if you don't want to do it in your home, you can go to a telehealth kiosk where, there's going to be the medical equipment there. So you can, check your pulse. You can, do all these different things that you can't necessarily do at your home. So super convenient, but we still can't do it because of the cross-state licensing issue. So hopefully this is something the FTC is actually going to be able to take on in the short term, and will have big benefits, because it's one of those things that anyone that uses it once is going to keep using it. It's that kind of experience.
Christina, Daniel's talking about barriers to using the internet to provide healthcare. That sounds like a job for the Goldwater Institute.
Indeed it is. I think it's absolutely right. I think reimbursement is a problem and regulation is a problem. It's amazing the innovations that are out there. There's actually a company that will allow you to get eye exams from your home. And we're not talking about medical eye exams. We're talking about something as simple as, glasses or contacts so that you can see. And of course, then the established industry, people who see, doctors who see patients in person, will step in and say, well, we've got to outlaw this. People have to come in to see their doctor, otherwise they won't have a relationship and they won't notice other health issues. But sometimes it's not always the best alternative. Sometimes it's a matter of not getting care at all, or being able to see your doctor or take these tests after hours. People work during the day. They're not always able to go in and see an eye doctor. And so it's really important to give people more options. If I can go into a store and pick up a pair of reading glasses, and as an adult, look through those glasses and say, gosh, I can see, or boy, I can't see, I should try another pair. I ought to be able to take an online vision test that allows me to get glasses as well that way. So I think regulation is a real problem. But I do think in some areas, we do see these dividends paying out. Look at LASIK, for example. LASIK costs less now than it ever did before, partially because we are paying for it mostly out of pocket, and so consumers are making decisions that are well thought out, and businesses are competing. Doctors are competing for our business. In fact, the other day I saw on Groupon, there's a Groupon for LASIK services. So internet dividends are paying off in healthcare in more ways than one.
Steve?
And for those of you who are nearsighted or farsighted and haven't learned to love the laser yet, you still wear contact lenses. And this may amaze you, but in the late 90s, when contact lenses were available online at 1-800-CONTACTS, optometrists were successful at blocking that business model completely. They claimed that I don't have to give you your prescription so that you could phone it in or use it on the internet to buy contact lenses. And we tried some lawsuits, we tried noise at the FTC, but ultimately what mattered was Congress. Congress enacted a law requiring an optometrist to give you your visual prescription or to give it to a provider who wants to sell you contacts within 24 hours or face sanctions. But it took an act of Congress to make that happen. We have to use tools like that because the optometrists claimed this was needed for consumer protection while they were making tremendous markups on private label lenses that would cost a fraction of that if you simply bought them from 1-800. So don't lose sight of the fact, as Christina said, is that an entrenched industry will use consumer protection laws and they will use them for competition prevention at the detriment of consumers.
Nomini, you want to jump in?
I just want to talk about the potential for telemedicine briefly. So before Ebola hit Liberia, there were 173 doctors in Liberia for a country with 3.5 million people. So when Ebola hit, many doctors died because they were exposed. So if you think about if there had been telemedicine, just the protection, the physical protection of doctors, it would have been really, really important. And that's why the U.S. government and other donors have gone in and funded internet projects in Liberia to help get telehealth to Liberia, to help assuage potential future pandemics and deal with basic health needs.
And I want to keep with you for a second, because whether it's an economic dividend, whether it's educational, or whether it's in healthcare, you can't benefit from any of those three things without electricity, because electricity powers the internet. And that's a major focus of your company, Tetra Tech. So the gap in electricity and the gap in internet access and usage, is there a lot of overlap? Are we talking about the same constituencies here who, maybe the question is not how to deploy broadband, but we're cart before the horse. How do we get electricity to people so that they can charge their cheap $50 Android smartphone, which is an incredible feat that there are these low-cost options, but you can't charge the damn phone if you don't have electricity. So how do we fix that gap?
That's a great question. So half the world doesn't have internet. So you're looking at about close to 4 billion people without internet access. And 1 billion of those people don't have energy access. So it's of the 1 billion that doesn't have energy is they don't have internet either. And they're not, the energy powers, their charging of the phone, it powers the internet servers that are working. It powers the production of the tools that they're using. So energy is really, really important. And with increased internet access, you're going to need more energy for the data centers that are supporting the internet. And like that, just funding that, you can't do that on diesel generators. So when we think about the people who do have an energy access, some of them are using diesel, and that's not sustainable for the internet as we think about going forward. So we're going to have to figure out both of those solutions together. Sometimes they can be done in tandem, right? If when you're putting up an electricity project, you can do energy with it, whether it's putting the power lines together or on the same lines, or running your internet station with solar. There's a lot of ways to do it together and do it in smart ways so that we have an internet that's good for our planet. The other thing, though, that's really important to think about is the cart before the horse. So if we want to, when we think about the internet generally, electricity was the internet of the past, right? In a lot of ways, it was the electromagnetic platform that powered the last industrial revolution, and the internet is this new industrial revolution. So if we think about how that spread and what expectations we had all for energy, it has improved our world, but it hasn't fixed everything. And so the internet is going to improve our world, but it's not going to fix everything. So we have to deal with the economic, social, and political problems that drive some of the issues that we have.
Anyone else want to add to that before we move to the next thing?
Just a footnote to that. Actually, it turns out when you look at the data, internet adoption is driving demand for electricity in places that never had it. So these are very, very symbiotic. So as people have, especially in parts of the developing world, as they get a phone, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a smartphone, they have to charge it. So then there's batteries, and then there are people actually sort of trying to put together some solar solutions, some off-grid solutions, but it's creating demand and that people now are investing in to also extend the grid. So it's very symbiotic.
And then the kind of the continued circle is that we're seeing an increased utilization of energy with pay-as-you-go. So using their mobile phones to pay for energy, and it's easier for the businesses to track their funds and get financing because they have an easy payment system. So it's a nice circle.
So let's do our last topic so we can leave room for audience Q&A. But information, right? This is one of the obvious positive things that the internet has delivered. Anyone with a connection, and it doesn't have to be a super fast connection, to access low bandwidth services like Wikipedia. Even in countries like Cuba, they have apps that work both offline and online. So there's incredible innovation in this space to deal with the various challenges in other countries. But while you have more and more access to information, few can look at the state of our public discourse today and say that it's wonderful, right? And that leads to us romanticizing the past when everyone had to watch Dan Rather or Walter Cronkite to get the news, and we all operated from the same set of facts and everything was so great. I tend to believe that more information, however hectic, is better. But have we lost the dividend of public discourse because we have too much information? And what sorts of dividends are we seeing just from having this information? Does merely having access to information pay a dividend for an individual, or is it just, I can watch YouTube videos and that's fun, but I can't really do anything with it to better my life? And feel free, anyone who wants to jump in.
Yeah, so going back to some of the findings from our study with The Economist, what we found was that in this area of relevance, right? So this is, how do I know whether the internet, why do I want to be connected? There were two categories of content that actually drove relevance and adoption. The first was local content and local language. That's actually really important. If you think about, again, globally, 10 years ago, the internet was in English. That's no longer the case. What we found was that local language is growing. The majority of the internet, the content, the websites are in local language. That actually drives adoption. That's really essential. The second type of content that drove adoption they called relevant content. But there were three types of content that made it relevant to people. eGov applications, especially in the developing world, because it allows people to do everything from register the birth of their child to get to register them and get a birth certificate, right? E-commerce and e-entertainment. And it's not obvious, actually, when you think about where there's a lot of e-content in terms of e-commerce and e-entertainment. I was meeting with the people from the ministry in one of the European countries, and they were struggling, and they actually did not have enough e-commerce, and part of it was because of their supply chain. So it wasn't just in terms of the application, it was completing that circle so things can be delivered. And they actually already understood that, but this helped them understand it at a deeper level. eGov applications, especially in the developing world, is a huge driver, because those are the applications that make the internet really, really relevant in a very real way for people. And what it does when you talk about or think about consumer surplus, the fact that a new parent does not have to spend half a day or 3/4 of a day walking to a county seat or the equivalent of a county seat to register the birth of their child and then come back again, right? That's huge time saving that results directly in consumer surplus to that family and to the breadwinner of that family, especially if it's an agricultural area. And those are the types of things that we're seeing that relate back to information, back to content, that drive relevance, adoption, and economic as well as social benefit.
Would anyone else like to discuss the information dividend?
I think one of the interesting things we see as we move from more traditional print media into digital media is a change in the kind of news that we're getting. And some would say a decrease in the quality, but there's more of an incentive to sensationalize these days, right? Funding for media is different than it used to be. Although there are some newspapers that still exist behind paywalls, typically it's advertisement driven online. And so the payoff is how many clicks you're going to get. The more clicks, then the more money for the news organization, and therefore there's an incentive to sensationalize. And so we see sort of a decline in really in-depth investigative journalism in traditional media. But I don't necessarily see this as a bad thing for a couple of reasons. One, keep in mind, traditional media back in the day was very sensationalized. Newspapers, print newspapers, used to be incredibly sensationalized, and they were all owned and beholden to corporate interests and special interests. Nowadays, we see decentralized information, whether it be Wikipedia, where the founder is a professed follower of Hayek and knows that decentralized knowledge tends to be very good. It tends to be a very good way of checking special interests or particular biases, or investigative journalism that's now moving to the nonprofit space. So we see nonprofits coming in, hiring investigative journalists that aren't beholden to a particular corporation or to a government, but instead can be more unbiased and fair and really spend the time doing the deep dive research. And so I think it's very different, and I think that this is generally a good thing. I think there's not a regulatory solution for this, whether we think this evolution is good or not, because the one thing that we don't want is for the government to be the controller of the information that we're getting or of our news.
Steve?
Yeah, we had a great plenary panel this morning discussing the notion of disinformation and thought bubbles, the way that people are gravitating towards silos of others who share their views. And that focused mostly on the notion of news and not enough on the issue of views. The digital dividend of people understanding others' views and being able to have more discourse about it is a dividend that we've destroyed. We've destroyed it because it's so easy to gravitate to others who share your views, even if it's all based on inappropriate news. We like the echo chamber. We've got to break that habit, and the internet may not actually be the answer to that. So it may not be the solution to that. We may have to do more like when maybe it was Andrew who said it this morning, of forcing himself to actually read the printed word. And at my home, we get both the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and I do force myself to read the entire front page and editorial page of those two. And by then, it's time to get the car and head to work. But that forcing yourself to actually read more than just the first 2 paragraphs before you're instantly distracted by a pop-up of an incoming email, a message, or an appointment that's coming up in an hour later today or tomorrow. Those distractions to our ability to actually read something are destroying the information benefits and dividends that we had coming. And I don't want to force people to turn their machine off. I don't want to force users of smartphones to turn off all the alerts. You can't do that. But our challenge is to create incentives to consume information and other views in a way that actually informs us, as opposed to just inflame you into saying, yep, sure enough, it's exactly how I thought it was.
I think without further ado, let's turn it over to audience Q&A. As far as I know right now, there are no questions online, but maybe that will change. But would anyone in the room, whether you're in this third, or this third, like to ask a question? And feel free to direct it to a panelist or not, and we can just let people answer it.
Sure. I'm Mike Godwin with R Street Institute, and this is a question to the panelists generally. I wonder if you want to talk about, when we're talking about different uses of the internet in order to get the internet dividend, it seems to me that one thing that you touch on, but maybe don't hit squarely, but maybe you want to touch on, is the fact that one of the dividends is simply our interconnectedness with one another. So that if you think about countries in the developing world that maybe have problems with food or water or access to healthcare or travel, the fact that you can connect to people who know how more easily to solve those problems actually facilitates solutions in the real world to water and to food and to access to medicine or to solutions about solving disease and so on, that our real dividend may actually be increased connection with more people and with communities that share needs or that can share informational resources.
It's a nice segue to, Mark Zuckerberg a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, re-articulating our mission, which is about creating communities. And it's all kind of communities. They can be small, it could be a family, it could be larger, it could be, those of us who, talk about or care about internet governance. It can be multiple communities, and we're all participants in multiple communities. So I think that's actually one of the huge benefits of the internet as we've seen it so far. And I think it's really one of the big advantages as we go forward, and this is exactly what we're focused on.
Yeah, just to add to that, it might seem mundane in the United States, a developed country, that we're all interconnected because it just means we can keep in touch with our loved ones and things like that are not necessarily life and death. But when you're talking about an app like WhatsApp in a developing country with an authoritarian regime, you have encryption protecting the content of your message. You are able to communicate things like, my crops are doing this, or there's a flood that's going to happen, and you don't have traditional landline telephone infrastructure necessarily to communicate that. So yes, I would definitely agree, Mike, that just being connected is itself a huge dividend, and that pays out in all of the categories we discussed today. Any other questions?
Thank you. So my name is Ashwita. I work at the Institute on Disability and Public Policy at American University. I think I want to get your opinion on inclusion and governance as a dividend itself. So at IDPP, we work with including persons with disabilities using technology in global governance processes. We have telepresence, and we facilitate their participation in UN conferences using teleconference and robots, etc. So is it my personal perspective as someone who works in this particular field? I see the technology and the internet as something that is directly beneficial to persons with disabilities and other marginalized and vulnerable communities. Is it my personal perspective, or is it a dividend across the board?
To make things a little personal, my brother had muscular dystrophy, a very severe form of muscular dystrophy. Technology enriched his life in ways I can't even really describe. I mean, he was able to put a dot on his Yankees hat, control his mouse by moving his head around. He had very little mobility. He could click. He could basically do everything on his computer. He can control the television. He can play his video games. And that helped enrich his life in ways that it might otherwise not have. And this was at NYU. There's a department that focuses specifically on accessibility, and I would say, at least personally, anecdotally, yes, it's an incredible dividend for people with disabilities to be able to make money. He was able to work for my dad's company for a little bit, doing some basic data entry, because he had those tools, and without them, you're looking at people just relying on government, maybe it's Social Security, maybe it's Medicaid, and that's fine, but the internet allows them to supplement that government stipend with real earned income and give people work and dignity that they might not otherwise have.
Your questions included a notion of, to the extent to which internet dividends have accrued to the customers of governments. I understand that, and I appreciate your point about the disabled. And disability access enabled by the internet will certainly increase one element of government. It's called participation. We will be able to participate better with respect to remote watching and being able to remotely express opinions, answer online surveys. We just did that in Fairfax County, for instance. But there's one area of internet dividends we expected with regard to government, and it was transparency. This notion that suddenly things that were happening in the dark would be much more accessible. And I don't think that dividend is working very well. Very few of the meetings where decisions are made are online. And here's the worst. Governments have a transparency project by which they publish their budgets and documents in a way that is completely impenetrable. And the assumptions behind them are inaccessible entirely. The notion of unfunded pension liabilities, which will bankrupt my children, are completely invisible in most of the online reports that I'll get from the government where I live. So we have to actually raise the ante on what it means for a government to be transparent to its people about the decisions they make, about what they're spending, not only of our money today, but of our children's money. Because as President Obama said when a senator, it is immoral for us to be foisting the costs of what we enjoy today on children of the future.
Maybe the internet has not made government transparent by intention, but people have certainly hacked many email accounts, and you can go read all that stuff online. So yes, we have government transparency. It just requires an illegal hack to get it. Does anyone else have a question? Oh, sorry, no, Minnie, you want to jump in?
So I agree that we aren't quite there yet with transparency, and you have the Open Government Project partnership that's working along those lines. But we are seeing some innovation in the space that's really exciting. So you've looked at, there's a program in India where they had people, actually back to education, teachers weren't showing up to teach kids, and they weren't learning anything, obviously. So they had people in the village just take pictures every day of the classroom. Wow. So, and then, you know, they were able to hold to account the teachers, shame them, right? Shamed by technology, and the teachers started showing up. And so there are ways that we're starting to see the use of technology, and I think that it kind of connects back to the first question. So right now in the United States, more than 90% of the money going to developing countries is from the private sector, not from development assistance. And kind of we can use these tools now to help the private sector figure out where are the most beneficial ways to go. And you're seeing, you know, floods of responses to disasters or development needs where you see the money going into. So there's definitely opportunity. We just haven't kind of maximized it yet.
Because the panelists kept their answers so succinct, we still have time for questions.
I just wanted to, Andrew Mack, I just wanted to respond to what you guys just said, which is that it sounds very interesting when we're talking about the dividends. The dividends are there for the taking, but the internet hasn't changed human nature. A person who wants to hide what they're doing will use the internet as a tool in the same way that a person who wants to uncover will use it. And so I think one of the things we have to do is be very realistic about which part of it is the tool and which part of the technology and which part of it is us. And on some deep level, if you want to be dishonest, the internet is just there for you in the same way that if you want to be honest. So I think that's a big part of the discussion of dividends.
Yeah, criminals could take the internet down in a heartbeat. The reason they leave it up is they're making so much money on it.
Quick question.
Any other questions?
So what would you say to the, you know, you just said something about how the internet is not transparent. As an African-American male, seeing videos of African-American men getting shot, and prior to that, you know, you would have had these police officers saying that the black guy was the problem. So is this attitude about how government is the problem, how the internet is not transparent, really helpful to this discussion? We've gotten all this talk about how government is bad. Government is bad only now because it seems that dark-skinned people have started to utilize some of the tools that they paid for. Now we get, von Hayek, all these other guys who suddenly want to tap down on the size of government, the starve the beast theory of getting rid of government. Isn't this actually the area where government should be most involved in ensuring that the dividends from this technology, which the U.S. government paid for, are distributed broadly?
I think that was directed at me, but private citizens shooting videos and putting them up on private networks is a great thing. We need more of it. I get that. My point was that the government itself didn't publish any of those videos, and if they had their way, the Chicago police would have suppressed everything about it. So it's about the governments not being as transparent as they pretend to be, despite the ability of tools to improve our ability to know what our government is doing and to hold it accountable. So by no means do I think that we should be suppressing, we should be encouraging those videos, but hold our government to be transparent about the way in which they're investigating and punishing what turn out to be egregious acts.
Yeah, absolutely. Things like body cameras, that's a digital dividend, right? But of course, it requires the government to actually use them properly. But we've also seen corporate accountability as a dividend from the internet. Just ask United Airlines, right? I mean, that would not have been as big a deal if not for social media. It would have been maybe a news story in the local paper. So yes, private citizens are definitely using the internet to hold institutions accountable. I think Steve's point was more that it requires government to do the same and be proactive about it. And that's maybe not what we're seeing. We're seeing potentially the opposite. We're seeing less transparency. We're seeing more decisions being made behind closed doors. Does anyone else want to jump in on that?
I think there's also an opportunity to learn from history. And, one of the things you mentioned, accountability for government, which is absolutely true. I think the biggest thing that government and the police have to fear now is the smartphone, right? Is that every citizen has a camera and we know the truth and we can catch them when they're abusing their power. But also just learning about how governments have abused their power in the past. There's actually a Twitter feed. There's a new movie coming out about the Detroit riots in the 60s. And there is a Twitter feed that's actually tweeting minute by minute what happened back in the 60s during those riots and telling the truth about it. And, it's really interesting because back in the day, can you imagine what would have happened if we had had Twitter, if we had had cameras, and we could tell the truth about what the police were doing in the city and what was happening in the city? But in fact, what had happened is the traditional news wasn't even reporting the way that they should have because the mayor asked the news not to do so, and citizens couldn't hold the news or government accountable. So I do think you're absolutely right. There's so much opportunity.
So you guys all do excellent work. So I would like to give you a chance, 30 seconds, final thoughts on all of this and where people can find your work and more information about your organization. So starting with you.
Yeah, I actually think the dividends have been huge. Right? I talked about those. In terms of the data, you can find support for that. But the WIC study is online, as is the study we did with the EIU. And if you're interested, I can give you the link. And as I said, the data actually, we're making all of the data from with the study we did with the Economist Intelligence Unit available, so people can do their own analysis.
Daniel.
Great. Well, I'll just mention we do have a report coming out next week where we're ranking states around data innovation, and we're looking at things like transparency and some of the laws in this space, which I think really affect the conversation we're having here. I'm just surprised we didn't talk about Tinder and online dating, because that was one of the big promises. And,
yes, that's a whole other panel.
Yeah.
Happy hour.
Yeah, right. Information is power, and whenever we decentralize power and we empower competitors to come in and disrupt the existing industries, those industries are going to go to government to try to outlaw their competition. And so at the Goldwater Institute, we try to help every single one of you in this room and every single one of you listening online have a say and protect your constitutional rights to be able to contribute to the economy in whatever way you see fit. So you can go to goldwaterinstitute.org to see the work that we're doing to protect the sharing economy. And if you have a problem, if you feel that you are the victim of overregulation, please reach out to us. We provide legal services at no cost.
Well, thank you. So information about Tetra Tech is available at tetratech.com. We are an engineering company that works in 130 countries. We have 16,000 people, and we do projects ranging from water and roads to energy and telecom, and we're finding the internet impacting all of it. So, we could do a fisheries project in the Philippines and end up doing a partnership with Microsoft on Super Wi-Fi because it helps people register their fishing license and record the size of their fish so that there's not overfishing. So it's we're just seeing the internet in every aspect of our practice.
On each of the tables, I put our little trifold about non-choice, and this is the trifecta: the goods economy, the gig economy, and the asset economy, and none of it is about the consumption side. It's all about the production side. The opportunity for people to earn income from their skills and their assets is unprecedented with the platforms that my industry has put out there in front of you. And I think it's bigger than any of you thought it was. It isn't just sharing, and Christina's not going to use that word after today, because you're not sharing anything. It's about earning income, not sharing it. And frankly, I want to answer Vince Cerf's challenge to us, which was try to find a way to make people's lives better. And I think the place to start is not giving them more stuff to buy, but giving them a way to earn income with internet platforms that we already have in place. Thank you.
General thoughts on the internet. I'm an optimist. I think to the extent that this seems like we were all pessimistic, it's because we're policy people and we identify problems and we want to try to solve them. But overall, I think it's been an incredible development in humanity's history, and I look forward to what comes next. And I'm not too worried. I'm comfortable with the organic bottom-up change that we've been seeing, and I think it's going to keep paying dividends. Shameless plug, I am the host of a podcast, the Tech Policy Podcast. My voice is not normally this raspy. And also, my organization tomorrow is holding our first inaugural all-day summit called Back to the Future of Policy. You can RSVP at techfreedomsummit.com. Hope to see you guys there. And of course, there is an after party tomorrow at Local 16 if you want to just skip all of the programming and drink and eat for free. I won't blame you. I've definitely done that before. But I want to thank our panelists. Can we get a round of applause for these amazing people?